everybody. Welcome today to Join Our Town. I'm your host, Janice Mount. We're glad you've joined us today. This program is designed to provide you with information to make a difference in your life and in your community. Today's program is going to be about health and nutrition. And this first segment of the program, we're talking specifically about MSG and aspartame, food additives. Our special guest today is Dr. Guillory, and we're so glad that you have joined us to educate us on this important topic. Welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been in practice in Aurora since 1985 and have always been interested in food intolerances and food sensitivities. I have a special interest in irritable bowel syndrome, and that's one of the things that led me into this food intolerance arena.
Okay, wonderful. And you are a board certified in internal medicine and a practicing doctor, also an assistant clinical professor. So you have a lot of experience and knowledge. I just want to set the stage so we know we're talking to someone who knows what they're talking about.
Well, I'd like to think so.
So let's get into the topic of MSG, which is also known as monosodium glutamate, and educate us about what that is and where we're going to find it.
Okay. Well, MSG is the sodium salt of glutamic acid, and glutamic acid is an amino acid. You have about 21 amino acids, and amino acids serve as building blocks for proteins. They also serve as neurotransmitters in the brain, and glutamic acid in susceptible individuals can overstimulate a receptor in the brain that can lead to migraine headaches and a host of other problems.
So how was MSG discovered?
MSG was discovered by the Japanese when they learned that when they put seaweed in soups and broths, it was more flavorful. And it turns out it was the glutamic acid being released from the seaweed that actually imparted that flavor. And then once that was discovered, as is often the case, they tried to figure out a way to commercially develop MSG, and then they started putting it in everything.
So, Dr. Guillory, where do you mostly find this? I know that when you go to Asian restaurants, you'll find that they have a lot of MSG, or you need to watch for it. Are there other foods that you're going to find MSG?
That's a very good question, because most people associate MSG with Chinese food or Asian food because the Chinese actually introduced it into the United States. But anymore, you're likely to find it in just about any restaurant. And the problem is it goes by a lot of different names. So when you're reading labels and you're trying to avoid it, once you've determined that you might be sensitive, you have to really understand all the different names that it goes by.
So we need to be watching for some of these names, and hopefully you're going to share some of those things with us. What are some of the harmful effects of MSG?
If you pick up any textbook now, for example, regarding migraine headaches, it will say dietary factors, and it will suggest that you avoid MSG. But again, it gets back to this whole issue of not really understanding all the different names that MSG goes by and really being able to, avoid it. If you're reading a lot of labels, you're probably getting some.
Oh my goodness. So are there any statistics as to where we'll find it and those kind of things and how it affects us?
Well, I'm certain that, again, if you're reading a lot of labels, you're probably getting it. So hydrolyzed vegetable protein, modified food starch, yeast extract, there's probably 50 different names that of ingredients that actually have MSG. So we've created a handout that we give our patients that lists all these names. And I would say that probably the majority of people are sensitive. They just don't realize it. Some are more so than others.
And how do you know if you're more susceptible to MSG or not, if it's going to affect you?
Well, again, migraine headaches, fibromyalgia syndrome, chronic fatigue, inability to concentrate. There are just a lot of different symptoms. There was one study done in 2001 where they looked at fibromyalgia patients and found that the majority improved with avoidance of MSG.
And Dr. Guillory, how does the MSG interact with our body?
The glutamic acid in MSG stimulates a receptor in the brain called the NMDA receptor, or the N-methyl D-aspartate receptor. And it's stimulation or chronic overstimulation of this receptor that results in symptoms, and more importantly, over time, results in neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's and things of that sort. So it's really, really bad. It's not just acute symptoms you might develop with chronic exposure. You actually can cause some neurodegenerative changes. There was actually a book written a few years ago entitled Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills, by Dr. Russell Blaylock.
So I'm going to try to simplify this a little bit. MSG is designed to enhance the flavor of foods, but it's more like a poison, and it could have long-term effects for some people or for all people.
Well, I think some people are more susceptible than others, and it really does enhance the flavor of food. We did a study in 1994. I was interested to see if MSG was a trigger for irritable bowel syndrome. So we applied for and got a grant from the PSL Foundation, and we fed patients a meal with MSG and without MSG to see what sort of symptoms we could elicit, mainly looking at digestive symptoms. It stimulates the taste buds, and in doing this study, we did a lot of testing with different types of foods. You know, what were we going to feed these people? It's the first time I've ever intentionally tried to make anyone sick.
Oh, no. So, but there are foods and there are ways to avoid it, and that's what we want to try to get to today. And before we get to that, there's another additive called aspartame. Does it have the same consequences, and is it used for the same purposes?
Well, it's not used for the same purposes, but I always talk about MSG and aspartame in the same context. And the reason being is that aspartame contains aspartic acid, which is another amino acid, which, like glutamic acid, stimulates that same NMDA receptor in the brain. And I'd like to make one other point about how bad this stuff is. There is a new drug out to treat Alzheimer's disease called Namenda. Namenda blocks the NMDA receptor, so it blocks the same receptor that's stimulated by aspartic acid and glutamic acid. So think about that for a minute. Here's a drug, blocks the NMDA receptor to treat Alzheimer's, the same receptor that's stimulated by these different amino acids, these so-called neuroexcitatory amino acids. If you're sensitive to glutamic acid, you're sensitive to aspartic acid.
And aspartame, what kind of foods would we find that in?
Most of your diet sodas contain aspartame.
Is it a sweetener?
Yes.
Okay.
It's an artificial sweetener. It's in a lot of diet sodas, sugar-free gum, sugar-free mints. I can't tell you over the years how many patients I've seen who consume large amounts of aspartame. You get them off the aspartame, and it's a life-changing experience for them. I had one patient who had gone to the Mayo Clinic. He had irritable bowel syndrome. He was drinking about a liter a day of a beverage that was sweetened with aspartame. I won't mention any names, but we got him off that sweetener, and it was 90% of his problem. So
there are a lot of artificial sweeteners, but this is among the worst.
Yes.
Okay. So how does a person know, so getting to there are ways that we can get around this. How does a person, first of all, know if they're sensitive to MSG?
Well, I would avoid it one way or the other, whether I feel like I'm sensitive or not, but I really think about it in the patient who has migraine headaches, for example. That's probably the #1 clue to me that someone might be MSG sensitive. And in my experience, probably 95% of patients that come to see us with migraine headaches, if we really can educate them about avoiding MSG and aspartame, end of story. They're not taking medications for their migraines, they're not missing work, they're not suffering with these headaches. Fibromyalgia syndrome I mentioned. I'm MSG sensitive, and I would venture to say most of your audience is. They just don't realize it. And when you really figure it out is when you go off of it for a while, you go clean, and then you have a little bit, and then you go, okay, I just don't feel right. And in my own personal experience, I get a low-grade headache, I can't concentrate, I get a little grumpy. The staff won't work with me if I've had MSG at lunch.
That's funny.